Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think it is like 12 o'clock on the dot. We're going to get started here. I'm Justin Pizzera with ABC15 News. I am joined by Dr. Nadia Bliss. She is the Executive Director of ASU Global Security Initiative. I'm also joined with Dr. Christy Roschke, the Managing Director of News Collab, which your goal of that organization is to advance media literacy through journalism, education, and technology. So thank you guys very much for joining us. We have been talking all week about news literacy, combating fake news, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. I guess whoever wants to go first, kind of lay out what is the difference between all of them, or is there even a difference?
I can start and then maybe Christy jump in at any point. The way that we tend to distinguish between mis and disinformation is the notion of intent. So misinformation is typically spread of false information without intent, so you shared something by accident, whereas disinformation tends to be intentionally there to deceive.
Okay.
Yeah,
Did you want to add anything, Christy?
I think I would just add that some people could consider misinformation things like satire. So things that are not true, but they're meant for, humorous purposes, or maybe, again, there's not that negative intent there that people might share thinking that they're real. So it can be anything from something that's intentionally false to other things that are like more humorous or fun in nature. When
did all of this start to come about? I think within the last couple of years, we've heard the term fake news quite a bit. But does it go? When did you guys start seeing this happening?
I guess again, I can start, and please, Christy, feel free to jump in. So the notion of disinformation is certainly not new. There have been many regimes that have deployed, for example, propaganda. The former Soviet Union is a good example of that. I think the big thing that has happened in the last couple decades, I would say, is essentially just the penetration of social network technology. So the scale with which false narratives can spread has really increased, and it's very, very easy to create a false narrative and have it spread.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I just think none of this is new. We've been sharing gossip and rumors, even amongst neighbors next door, by word of mouth for as long as humans have existed. But to Nadia's point, now that we have this networked technologies that can make this information spread, you just see the effects on a much greater scale.
Nadia, I don't know if you can maybe speak to this. Is this kind of like a war in America here? The Department of Homeland Security just issued a warning for domestic extremists yesterday. A lot of that has just been, they're talking online and just kind of rallying the troops.
There are certainly national and homeland security implications, and of course, global security implications as well. I think one of the things that I'll kind of bring up again is just, it is so incredibly easy to create the narrative and then have it spread really fast. And then, of course, the other thing that has been really troubling, and we have seen it play out, of course, very recently on January 6th, is that the disinformation narratives have contributed to actual violence and loss of life, and that's the most recent example. But of course, there are others. So there are absolutely national, homeland, and global security implications.
Christy, did you want to speak to that as well?
I think Nadia pretty much covered it.
You kind of touched on, the riots at the Capitol, that insurrection. There's been a lot of talk about, former President Trump's Twitter being shut down, Parler being shut down for kind of pushing these false narratives. Is that a part of combating this? Because a lot of people believe that is violating free speech.
Well, it's a tricky situation, and I know Nadia will have other thoughts on this too. But Twitter, Parler, Amazon, those are all private companies, and they are well within their rights to remove the speech that violates their terms of services. So I think there is a lot of confusion and maybe miseducation in terms of the first and the types of protections of speech we can expect in these online spaces. And certainly there's a lot more conversation, policy conversations, legislative conversations that need to be had around these issues. I'm not sure that I would suggest deplatforming willy-nilly as a strategy for combating misinformation, but it is a strategy that's proven effective. I think we need some clearer guardrails around that, though, for sure.
I know President Trump's son said that how is a Iranian dictator with sordid human rights records be able to maintain a presence on Twitter? So they thought it was a double standard there. I don't know if you can speak to that, maybe, Nadia. I mean, trying to combat that, what is your opinion on just shutting down some of these sites?
So I think, so there's a couple of things. First of all, Twitter, Facebook, Parler are all private companies, so the free speech is kind of protected with regards to government. So government can shut down your free speech, but Twitter, Facebook, Parler, all those companies can do, it's at their discretion. Second of all, I would say that when we're at a point when it's hate speech or inciting violence, moderation and deplatforming seems like an entirely reasonable approach. And even if it's not deplatforming, indicating that something is false, or something that has not been confirmed in more reliable sources, I think those are entirely reasonable techniques. And I do always think that inciting violence, that's not what these platforms are meant for.
I do want to say, everyone that is joining us, if you have any questions, make sure that you put the questions so we can get to them. I do have one from David Rosenfeld. He wrote in and he said that when he has questions about information that he's seen or has been shared, he leans towards fact-checking services, PolitiFact, Snopes, factcheck.org, news service organizations that he considers have a vested interest and respect for their own integrity. He lists the New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, Boston Globe. His question is, how do you argue these organizations' credibility when they have been vilified as being biased? This almost always gets an eye roll from my right-leaning friends as they're just the opposition.
Well, I want to start off by saying that he has an impressive arsenal of techniques and tactics to find credible information. Those are all the kinds of things we teach our students to do. So I want to say congratulations there. And I mean, it is increasingly, yeah, exactly, a little round of applause. It's increasingly difficult to have these conversations about credible information sources because it has become such a politicized topic. And, I have these conversations every day in my world. And I think one of the things that I like to point out are the ways in which, helping people understand the ways in which information is produced and distributed. So there's a huge difference between information that a reporter has gone out and talked to original sources and done original research and then cites those sources in a transparent way. That journalistic process that we know we follow a certain code of ethics. Not everyone understands or knows what that process is. I think that's part of the problem. I think we take for granted that everyone kind of knows what a reporter's job is. And really, everyone doesn't know that. And when an article that has been sort of appropriately reported can sit alongside an article that's just totally made up and they look exactly the same, it can be very difficult for people to understand. I think when we're talking about the polarization, though, almost a bigger issue is that so much of the political, I'm going to put news in air quotes right now, that we see, particularly on cable news, is not actually news at all. It's opinion, it's punditry, it's commentary. And there are whole programs that make up, the whole evening block of cable news programs, that it's just one set of opinions after another that people conflate with news. And it's really easy to do online too, because a lot of news isn't labeled. So you might see a headline to an opinion article it's meant to cite an opinion and evoke an emotion, and people take it as news, and then they take that as evidence that a certain news source is biased. So there's a great misunderstanding between news and opinion, even sections within a certain organization, and the separation there. So there's a lot of education that we need to do to help people understand those nuances, so that they can get a better sense of where a news organization sits actually in terms of a bias or a slant.
If I can also just jump in briefly, particularly in context of things like the pandemic or other medical news, I think you can often cross-reference to entities, sort of institutions that are formally doing the scientific rigorous work and doing the proper scientific research. So if you're looking for information on the pandemic, it makes a lot more sense to go to, for example, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Mayo Clinic than it does to an opinion piece in any newspaper. So coming back to those trustworthy institutions is something that I also tend to go to, especially, if someone says, no, New York Times is not for me. I'm like, okay, well, let's then go check out Mayo Clinic and CDC. Those are not biased news organizations, however you define bias.
How do you know, I guess, if one of these organizations, are, I guess, what a legit organization? I mean, I think a lot of people consider the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal legit, organizations, media outlets, but there's a lot of people that don't. They believe that they're fake. So how does how are they supposed to tell?
Well, there's some simple things that you can do. A legit news organization mostly is going to have bylines on stories, so you'll know who wrote the story. And more news organizations are leaning toward not only just a name, but also a little bit of a bio, so you can get a sense of that person's qualifications for reporting the story. Being explicit and transparent about certain policies, like how and when to use anonymous sources, for instance, is a really great thing a legit news organization will do to let people know that they have a process for thinking these things through. Maybe a corrections policy. So anytime a news organization needs to change something because either they got it wrong or the information has been updated, having a written policy to help people understand how those decisions are made those are things that legitimate, credible news organizations do. Those are not things that misinformation peddlers do. So I think those are some things you can do. And then in terms of finding credible information, if a New York Times is going to report that something happened, chances are there's going to be a whole handful of other news organizations that are reporting the same thing. So if you see a piece of information that comes through, maybe a push alert on your phone, and you're like, I'm not sure I'm going to believe CNN on this, it's a really easy thing to do. Just Google the news and find out what other news organizations are talking about it. You can sort of triangulate. If 15 news organizations reported the same thing, at that point, you have to accept that it's credible.
Did you have anything to add on that one?
I will just emphasize the importance of cross-checking. So especially if something looks, if it's meant to kind of inspire emotion or really feeds into confirmation bias, something that you believe, or a particular set of opinions that you have, it is a really good practice to just do a quick Google search and see if you can find a few additional sources. I mean, the other thing that I tend to go to is I tend to think about incentive structures and business models of these organizations. Which is one of the reasons my fact checking I often do on National Public Radio. So that's a not-for-profit platform that is really focused explicitly on reporting, as opposed to driven by ad content or clicks. So I think that's another thing to think about. How does this organization make money?
We'll touch on that just a little bit later on the making money part. But what about algorithms? How does that come into play on social media? Because I know when you're I'm on Instagram, and all of a sudden I just kind of see the same posts over and over. I'm like, why am I seeing the same person all the time? And does that come into play? I mean, if you're clicking on something that's bad, that's fake, that's truly false, I mean, does that just keep perpetuating it?
Yeah, so a lot of these platforms have kind of adaptations where they learn a little bit about who you are, right? So I, for example, said, when we were chatting earlier, that I'm not on Facebook, partially because I am a privacy hawk and I don't like that information being collected and computed about me. But the more information, the more things you do on social media, the more those platforms can learn about the preferences that you have. And if you come back to this notion that there is this currency of clicks and sharing content. So I'm a big fan of cats. It's going to serve me more cats. I follow giant military cats and General Caddis. So now all the cat slash national security military Twitter shows up in my feed. That's just how those things work. So the same thing with, these informations learn your political preferences, your information preference, your source preference, and your connection networks and what their preferences are as well.
I'll just add that we encourage our students to download the information that Facebook, Twitter, and Google know about you. Instagram, you can find your little dossier of information on any of those platforms to see what they think that they know about you. And I do that every so often because it's just fascinating. Some of it's very obvious, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I deserve that. And then some of it's like, I don't really know why, how those things interconnected. So I think it's helpful to know sort of like how these platforms perceive you, and so that they can serve up certain types of information for you. I do also want to make the point, though, that although we are not privy to how those algorithms work because they are proprietary and the platforms don't make them available to us, we do provide input. So to Nadia's point, she doesn't go to the platform because she doesn't want to give that information. But it's important for us to realize we're providing the input that then, generates this algorithm. So to be thoughtful about the kinds of things we click on, the kinds of things we like, knowing that that's going to potentially manipulate the things that we see. It's just a really important thing to be mindful of. And also, I just want to make that point that social media platforms don't serve up news we haven't asked for. So by following legitimate news organizations that we trust, we're more likely to get information that we trust. And then the reverse of that is true as well.
That's interesting about pulling up your social media profile as well.
It can be kind of embarrassing, I'm not going to lie.
Is it really? And that's an easy find on social media?
Yeah, I mean, if you just Google what does Facebook know about me, Facebook has has step-by-step directions on how to download that data. Twitter and Google do the same thing.
We were talking, here in the newsroom about Sharpiegate, if you guys are familiar with that. I mean, that was something that just basically got out of control. And it was all over social media. And we are still dealing with basically the fallout from Sharpiegate that, it was a lie. And it spread so fast.
Well, I think, my guess there again is that it's something that fed into a lot of emotion. And, the first thing I did when those news started popping up was I went to the Secretary of State website, right? That's going to be the reliable source of information around the election. And then similarly, you can follow the statements from the governor's office and other officials that oversee the election in the state of Arizona. So kind of at that point, almost putting the news on hold and going to the institutions that are charged with essentially carrying out whatever task was, which in that case was elections.
The recently Dominion Voting Systems has filed a defamation lawsuit against Rudy Giuliani, seeking $1.3 billion in damages for what they say is demonstrably false allegations. Their complaint, I was reading just a little bit of it today, says that he cashed in by hosting a podcast where he exploited election falsehoods to market gold coins, supplements, cigars, and protection from cyber thieves. So is that something that we're seeing as well now, some of these organizations or just people themselves cashing in on fake news, on spreading some of these falsehoods?
Oh, absolutely. Like that also is not a new thing at all. That's snake oil sales bit, that's been going on forever. There's always going to be people who want to capitalize on information or fake information. And this is just a new supercharged way to do it because your audience is bigger than it's ever been before. And you have the ability to reach people in ways that, the snake oil salesman had to travel from town to town, and now he can just sit at his computer and reach the whole world. So absolutely, people are going to cash in. It's kind of the whole point of this. Cashing in can be monetarily. There can be other reasons, power. There are other reasons why people want to cash in on this. But that's basically the whole name of the game. it's interesting to me. So we were talking about incentives before in terms of, platforms awarding your attention with more content. I think one of the things that the Dominion case is really interesting is how can we de-incentivize this behavior? And hitting people in the pocketbook is a pretty obvious way to de-incentivize this behavior, or disincentivize, I guess.
Yeah. I think there's also, this is a good example, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit, is just this, what's new about the situation precisely now, as opposed to, 20, 40, 60 years ago when rumors and propaganda still existed. And I think it is that confluence of technology with the narrative, that there is this amplification that is essentially for free. It's very easy to get the amplification if you tap into that narrative. And I think that's what we're seeing. So not only do you have a snake oil salesman, you now have a snake oil salesman optimized with algorithms and servers. And then you are just an individual person trying to figure out what's out there and what makes sense and what is accurate information, trusted information, and what isn't.
How do you think that this lawsuit will kind of change things? $1.3 billion in damages, that is significant. Do you see that kind of changing? I don't know. How is it going to change anything as far as misinformation, malinformation, fake news, this kind of a lawsuit?
I don't know, and I'm not a legal expert, so I can't say really, what kind of chances Dominion has. But certainly, slander and libel are legitimate things, and profiting off of lies should be punished. So I would like to see more of that happen. Again, I feel pretty strongly that financial sanctions are going to be the main way that we can really make a dent in this problem. So, I'll be watching it closely.
I think it comes back to those incentive structures. And exactly as Christy was saying, the cost of spreading, if the cost of spreading disinformation becomes significant, that is a disincentive to spread it. So I am also not a legal expert, but I do think from an incentive perspective, this is very interesting to watch.
One of the attorneys for Dominion, I thought he gave an interview to the Washington Post, and I thought he had a very interesting quote. He says, from a defamation law perspective, it just demonstrates the depth to which these statements sink into people. People don't just read them and tune them out. It goes to the core of their belief system, which puts them in a position to take action in the real world. I just thought that statement was powerful there.
Well, and I think this is one of the reasons, one of my sort of top kind of thing to do. If something is making you feel really emotional when you read it, that is a really good moment to step back and check the source, because a lot of these specifically disinformation campaigns are meant to incite emotion. So you can almost use that emotion as a really good signal to go and cross-check and triangulate, just as Christy was saying, with a number of different sources.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. That's the first thing I tell anyone when we're talking about this, is that you always want to stop and take a beat. And I'll just add to that, while you're stopping, definitely don't share something. Don't share something and say, I haven't had a chance to check this out, but it seems interesting. That's the worst possible thing that you could do, because then you're just keeping it out there and allowing it to perpetuate without even knowing whether or not it's true.
In your personal opinion, for both of you, what role does the government have to play in stopping misinformation, stopping fake news?
I guess I'll start. So I think there's a couple of different dimensions. I think one of the dimensions is there's tremendous opportunity for research and transition of those research products. A really good example, I was listening actually to The Daily, which is the New York Times podcast, and it sounds like a lot of the disinformation that was spread around the January 6th event basically was very easy to check. So obviously doctored photos, obviously misdated news articles. That sort of stuff can be really quickly picked up by automated tools, by algorithms. That's really easy. So both development of those tools and transition of those tools to practice is something that absolutely makes sense for agencies like Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and National Science Foundation to fund that kind of work continuously and looking 10, 20 years out. There is also something to be said for looking at the incentive structures around that, because right now, I really don't see any regulations, and I'm not really necessarily a huge fan that Facebook and Twitter get to decide how they are going to police themselves. That seems counterintuitive to me. The other thing, the one last thing I'll mention, so I see opportunities for research and transition. I see that there's a need for legislation and potential for regulations. And the third thing is that just both technical and media literacy is something would be fantastic to see both in the lawmakers and on staff. And there are programs that support that already. And I imagine there will be a lot more of that because, if Mark Zuckerberg is testifying before Congress, we shouldn't be asking him about the intertubes. We should be asking him about, how does, singular value decomposition contribute to the type of feature sets he collects around the data that you spread. And I'm not saying that was not a direct quote. I don't know if anybody asked him about the intertubes, but that's as a computer scientist when I was listening, how that came across to me.
I'm just going to add to that I agree that, my area of expertise is in media literacy education and research. And so I do think that one of the most promising things we could do is to think about, a national curriculum for media digital literacies. Nothing of the sort exists. And, our education system is so localized and fragmented that it's really hard to drive change in education. So I would love to see more of a national focus on that, because I think in the long term, a better education about how our technology works, how we communicate in a digital sphere, we need to be better prepared. So much of what we do right now is defensive. And this is the most proactive thing we can do, is to start training people early and often throughout their lives. We can't do that without a national push in education. And then I do want to say with regard to the intertubes, I think education for legislators is imperative, because you could see in all of these tech congressional hearings that the people leading these hearings don't know the questions to ask. And I'm not a computer scientist, and even I can see that these end up being almost meaningless because we're not actually getting at the root of the problem, because the people in charge don't know the questions to ask. So I think that would be a really great opportunity too.
When you talk about, Christy, when you talk about this media literacy and teaching and classes, what do you think that should look like? Are we starting young? Is this, teaching in elementary school, high school?
Oh, absolutely. I think that it means different things at different points in a person's life cycle. But my son was using an iPad when he was like 2 years old. So he was interfacing with digital technology and using it for communication at that age. And I'm not going to be telling him about incentive structures and representation and like the business model of journalism when he's 2, but I can absolutely start teaching him about privacy and security and even propaganda, because he sees advertisements and that sort of thing. So for me, media literacy really is all about the ways in which we interact with messages. And aren't we just inundated with messages all day long, whether they're news or entertainment or some other kind of propaganda? So we have, and I was a high school teacher for a long time, so I know that there's not a formal curriculum for including these kinds of conversations in all subject areas. And, Nadia's mentioned a couple times the importance of original source material and really honoring like the research and the data that we have access to. We also don't do a great job of incorporating that into our daily lives. Science class is about science experiments. It's not about reading more about pandemics so that we can find better coronavirus information. So I think, yes, for me, this is just a lifelong pursuit that media should be incorporated into every class at every age level.
I think if I can just add a point there, because I absolutely agree in teaching that media literacy and teaching it really, really early. So I also have a reasonably young child, and we have been talking since she was very, very young about the potential dangers. And right now we do a reasonable job just teaching kids how to use technology, but we don't teach them that security mindset. So if I share something, what does that mean? What can someone do with that information? Why is privacy important? Why should I not, trade direct information when I'm trading my Roblox, I don't know, neon snowman, whatever it is, right? So having that security mindset really, really, really early on, I think is incredibly important. And I think that is something, that's another thing that the government can really help with, funding those sort of curriculums.
How do we repair some of these organizations, I guess, the trust? I was talking to Katie Hobbs yesterday about news literacy, interviewing her, and just trying to get that trust in the system. And so much has been done to really, tear apart the trust in even our voting system. And now there's a lot of people that don't trust the media. They don't trust what I have to say. Is there any chance that we can rebuild that? Where do we even start on that? Because it seems like, I can tell you just from my own experience, I can present somebody with the facts and they do not believe them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of, repairing and restoring and rebuilding. And I think that's where we need to be and what we need to focus on in large part right now, because it's not just in media. So institutional trust is down kind of across the board. And, research finds that people who are not trusting of media are also likely not to be trusting of government, of higher education, business, other institutions that we rely on in democratic society. So it's a bigger problem than just the media. Media is a scapegoat in many ways, because we interface with it so often, and you all are the gatekeepers of that information. So you're often the front, the forward facing thing that we see. But I mean, again, I come back to education in part. This isn't going to help maybe adults as much as it will help future generations, and steeping, ourselves in civics a little bit more, democratic participation, a better understanding of how these systems work and why they work the way they work. I also think it's a really important time for reflection and thinking about how we got to this place and why it is that certain people are so ready to believe these counter narratives. I don't know that we have a single set of facts at this time, and insisting that our facts are the facts probably isn't the best way to resolve it. So I'm optimistic for more conversation. I think that definitely has to be part of it.
The other thing that just to echo a couple of Christy's points, this notion of reinstating trust in trusted institutions, again, places like, CDC, generally federal government, legislative bodies, experts, scientists as a whole. I think that's really, really important. I will say something that has been on my mind a lot recently, that, typically when you're an expert and you're really talking from your place of expertise, you feel empowered and okay to say that you don't know something. So that's something, having this culture of trust in experts, trust in expertise, and also saying that sometimes that you don't know the answer. This is something that I just heard Dr. Fauci recently do at a press conference a couple of days ago. And one of the goals of disinformation is to create that discord, right? So you just don't know what to believe. So if we collectively start rebuilding trust in those institutions, collectively accept that experts sometimes don't know. Both Christy and I said we are not legal experts, so we don't know what the legal implication of the Dominion lawsuit is going to be. And having that culture infused from, K through 12 all the way through lifetime learning, I think I'm cautiously optimistic. Cautiously.
Do you think is it changing a belief system? Is it changing just what people look up? Because it seems like there's a group of people that it's like, well, they are not just going to trust the media. They're not going to trust the government. Is it convincing them, Or is it just let them go and let's just work on the people that are coming up? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think it's an either or. And I also don't think convince is like a word that's going to get anywhere, because as we've talked about a couple of different times, these are deeply held beliefs that have, people have had tapped. And, I'm not going to tell someone that what they believe is wrong. Who am I to say? And in some cultural, they're religious, they are, they're familial. And so it's a place to tell you that you're right or wrong. That's not really what this is about. I think it's more about, and I'll go back to what Nadia said, it's how do we come to know the things that we know? We create consensus. How do experts discover information that moves us along as a society? And how do we effectively communicate to people such that it shouldn't really matter what your system is? I mean, there's always going to be tension between maybe beliefs and a set of established facts for certain people. And those are different things for different people. So we can't erase that. What we need to get back to is how you balance those things. And that's, I think, what we lost, and something that is enabled by social media, because you can just hammer these messages in this way where you just become so wrapped up into it, it can be hard to unwrap yourself. So it's kind of it's almost like a deprogramming in some ways, but I don't think convincing is the way to do it. And, from a media perspective, I work in a journalism school. I train young journalists. Like, I'm not there to tell them to convince their audiences that they're right simply because they're journalism. I feel like we need to actually take a look at ourselves and figure out what it is that we have to offer, so that we can get back to a place where we generally have the same idea about what is real and maybe what's not real.
I do think there's also something to be said for the transparency of how the platforms share the information. So you shouldn't have to be a computer scientist to understand that information is being served to you by an algorithm, right? So you think that you're getting this article because your friend Fred shared it with you, and you really trust Fred, but really you're getting it because you and Fred have clicked on a bunch of other things that are similar. And having this notion of making sure it's not blaming people, because it's not someone's fault necessarily that they're believing something that they read, especially if it's shared from someone that they consider a friend. But understanding that there is this significant computational backing between how this information being served to you, and that the speed of how that information spreads is difficult for an individual to parse. That is why you're hearing both me and Christy saying, pause, move away, go do your own checking, because what's being served to me algorithmically may not necessarily be the information that I need.
I was interviewing the founder of the Reboot Foundation, which is an organization that promotes media literacy and really educating folks about that. And she said that in her studies that a lot of Americans, they really don't know how to fact check their own, when they read these stories, or they just won't do it. Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's more that they aren't going to do it. And getting back to what Nadia just said about the speed, like it's really impractical to expect someone to fact check everything that they see. I don't ever counsel anyone. I would love that, but I don't do it because I don't have time. Right. Who has time? And a fact check. So, and this is interesting, like a fact check in a journalistic sense is very different from like what I do when I say I fact check something. And that's something I think news organizations could be better, and fact checking organizations, frankly, could be better about explaining. It's like, it's not just Googling it to see if it's true. A fact check is a very deep, intensive process. And we would all be better to know more about that. But what I think we're talking about is those items, and Nadia said this a couple of times, that spur that emotion, that make you get, really mad or really like feel vindicated, or those things where you're like, that's got to be too good to be true. Like it is. So take 20 seconds to, cross-check it. I mean, what we teach people to do, I think, is more of that cross-checking than an actual fact check. 9 times out of 10, Snopes is already on it, right? So you can get that sort of immediate feedback. But it's just improbable to expect people to care so much that they want to fact check everything. The other thing I want to bring up, it's kind of related, is that most people don't pay attention to news at all. We put a lot of stock into how much people are following political news, how much they think the news is fake. But the truth is that a lot of people don't pay attention to the news at all. So this really isn't always a news problem. It's just it's an information problem. It's the meme, the thing that your friend says. It's it's a commercial that you've seen, and so slowing down to parse that, as Nadia said, every now and again is, I think, a smart thing to do.
And it's hard, it's hard to innately sort of know that behind that piece of information that's being served to you on your Facebook feed is literally like rooms of servers and hundreds of thousands of lines of code, right? So if you think about that for a second, you're like, oh no, I'm just a single person and this is being served to me. And what is it up? What kind of optimization function is it using? And if it's using the optimization function based on what somebody's going to click on, it almost makes sense intuitively that it's going to serve you something that's going to make you feel emotional. So having that transparency, I mean, this is why, again, while propaganda, rumors, misinformation, disinformation are not new, this moment that we're in is pretty unique because it's this confluence of technology with this kind of environment that we're in. And it's just, those changes, those switches are just so much easier to switch, and potentially could lead to either people arguing about established medical fact or lead to violence. And that's where it becomes really problematic.
As we kind of wrap things up, what would you say to the folks that are watching this? I mean, if they need to fact check, or what's a key takeaway, if both of you want to answer that?
Well, something that just came up listening to what Nadia just said is, when we're thinking about information specifically on social media, when you think about the ads that are placed in your feed that become personalized with other things that you've browsed, I get all these ads for like home furnishings when I'm buying a new couch. I think we have a better understanding of why and how that happens in the ad space, that it's trying to persuade us, and that Facebook has gathered this information based on our other internet usage. The same thing is happening with other forms of information. So I wonder if we could kind of think more along the lines of, this is an online ad being served up to me. Why is it being served up to me? It might help us make different decisions about what we do with that information.
I guess my sort of big takeaway is always just, pause, be patient, and go back to expertise, especially if it's something that feels like it's inciting some sort of emotion.
All righty. Thank you, ladies. Dr. Nadia Bliss, Dr. Christy Roschke, thank you very much for joining us. And for those of you that are watching, we do have a link on our website, ABC15.com, for News Literacy Week. Just a whole host of information there on our website. Thank you, ladies, for joining us, and thank everyone.